Charleston, 1852. The air was thick with salt and rot, the kind that clung to the lungs and whispered of decay. In a narrow alley off Broad Street, beneath the flicker of a dying lantern, the scream split the night, the kind that made even the rats pause. When neighbors forced open the door, they found Mary Ellen Wexler, the town's most trusted midwife, cradling something swaddled in linen. Her face was pale, her hands trembling, and the thing in her arms wasn't crying. It wasn't breathing. But its eyes were open. What the townsfolk saw that night would ripple through Charleston's whispers for decades, the birth that defied nature, a secret buried in the marshes, and a woman accused of summoning life where none should exist. They said she delivered monsters. But Mary Ellen always claimed she delivered truth. Before the rumors began, Mary Ellen Wexler was known only as the Night Woman. She was small, wiry, with eyes like ash and a quiet voice that never trembled, not even when blood ran thick beneath her hands. For nearly 20 years, she'd served Charleston's poorest families, answering knocks long after midnight. Her hands had delivered more than 300 children into the world, most screaming, some silent, and a few born still and carried away before dawn. She never married. Never spoke of her past. Some said she'd come from Savannah after the fever took her kin. Others whispered she'd been shipwrecked and washed up on Folly Beach with nothing but her satchel of herbs and a silver crucifix. No one knew the truth, then she offered none. In a city built on superstition and suffering, the woman with secrets was safer than one without them. Her little home on Archdale Street smelled of camphor, sage, and lye soap. Jars lined her shelves, powders, dried roots, and vials labeled in her thin, deliberate handwriting. She treated the poor without charge and buried the unclaimed infants herself. The church tolerated her, but the physicians, all men, despised her quiet competence. To them, she was an old relic of peasant medicine. To the women of Charleston, she was salvation. But something changed in the spring of 1852. The fever had returned to the docks, and strange births began to trouble the town. Infants born with twisted limbs, translucent skin, and eyes too wide for their skulls. Families hid them. Priests refused baptisms. And when one mother died screaming her child was wrong, the whispers turned toward Mary Ellen. They said she used the swamp herbs too freely. That she buried things in the marsh that weren't quite dead. A physician accused her of witchcraft, an old insult in a city pretending to be modern. One night, she was called again, her delivery on the edge of town, where the air stank of brine and rot. She hesitated before answering, as if the darkness itself had shifted. The messenger, a boy no older than 12, only said, "It's happening again." That night, she took her satchel, her crucifix, and her silence, and walked toward the edge of Charleston, where the cries of the living and the dead were said to sound the same. And by morning, no one would ever see her the same again. The house stood near the marshlands, where the soil turned black and the air hummed with mosquitoes. Mary Ellen's lantern cut a small circle of light through the mist as she approached. The cries from inside, low, strangled, not entirely human, made her hesitate at the threshold. She whispered a prayer before stepping through. The mother, Anna Delacroix, lay drenched in sweat, her hair plastered to her face. A planter's daughter married to a dock worker, she had come to Mary Ellen months before, desperate and pale, whispering that something moved wrong inside her. Now, in the flicker of oil light, Mary Ellen saw the terror in her eyes. The bath began like any other. Boiling water. Clean rags. The steady rhythm of pain and breath. But something was wrong. The contractions came too fast, too violent, as if the body itself was fighting what it carried. When the child finally came, the silence that followed was worse than any cry. Mary Ellen froze. The infant was small, impossibly small, yet its eyes were already open. They reflected the lamplight like wet glass. Its skin was almost translucent, veins faintly blue beneath the surface. The fingers, too long, too jointed. And the mouth, though it never opened, twitched as if forming words. Anna tried to lift her head. "Is it alive?" she whispered. Mary Ellen wrapped the infant tightly, her own hands trembling for the first time in years. "Don't look," she said softly. "Rest now." But Anna saw and began to scream. The sound tore through the house out into the swamp air where even the frogs seemed to fall silent. The husband fled into the night. Mary Ellen held the wrapped bundle close, whispering to it like a prayer. The thing inside shifted once, then stilled. By dawn, both mother and child were dead. The doctor who arrived later that morning refused to touch the body. He called it an abomination, a punishment, perhaps, though proof of sin. The neighbors crossed themselves as Mary Ellen passed. The midwife buried the remains herself, deep in the marsh beyond the oaks, where the earth swallowed everything without question. She marked the spot with a single stone. No name. No date. Only silence. But by the next week, when fishermen began finding strange, pale shapes washed up along the tide line, they remembered her and her monsters. And that was when the whispers became fear. By the end of spring, Charleston no longer slept. The fever had claimed dozens, and the air over the river carried the smell of sickness and salt. Yet it wasn't the disease that kept people awake, it was the whispers. The women at the market, the priests, even the sellers at the tavern spoke of what Mary Ellen Wexler had done in the mash house. Some said she'd tampered with the bath, mixed herbs that no Christian woman should touch. Others swore they saw her burying something that moved beneath the soil. A few whispered that she'd been seen near St. Philip's churchyard at midnight, standing by the infant graves with her lantern dimmed, as if listening for something. The city's doctors, eager to protect their reputation, called a quiet meeting under the pretense of a public health. They agreed the midwife was dangerous. Her practices were unscientific, her medicine unclean. But beneath their polished words was something more primitive, fear. Fear of a woman who knew what they could not explain. Each day brought more strange births. A stillborn child with bones that bent like wax. Another with eyes sealed but fluttering beneath the lids. Mothers swore their wombs twisted as if the infants fought to stay inside. And each time, when the priests were called to bless the dead, they found Mary Ellen's name on the bath sheets. Father O'Leary, the city's youngest priest, visited her home one humid evening. He found her alone, grinding herbs into powder, the windows open to the summer flies. "Sister," he said quietly, "they are saying you're summoning something unnatural." Mary Ellen didn't look up. "They call it unnatural when they cannot explain it." He pressed further. "And what do you call it?" She paused, her motor still. "Suffering that takes form," she murmured. "And sometimes, it takes a face." The priest left unsettled. That night, the church bells rang twice, though no one had pulled the rope. The sexton found the bell rope swaying as if caught by invisible hands, and a trail of wet footprints leading from the font to the door. By morning, Father O'Leary ordered the infant graves sealed with stone. No one was to approach them again. But when the sun rose over the graveyard, a fresh soil lay disturbed, and a single swaddling cloth rested atop one of the tombs, soaked in something dark. And still warm. And from that morning on, even the church began to fear her. Charleston's physicians met in secret that summer, not in their offices, but in the candlelit back room of Dr. Thaddeus Roper's apothecary. The shutters were drawn tight, the air thick with pipe smoke and iodine. Their purpose was clear, to bring an end to the midwife's influence before panic consumed the city. Dr. Roper, tall and severe, had been the first to examine one of the so-called unnatural births. He'd refused to speak publicly about what he saw. But among his colleagues, his silence cracked. The bones were hollow, he confessed. Like a bird's. And the lungs, they were fused, as though made for something that doesn't breathe the way we do. No one spoke for a long time after that. Then another doctor, younger, nervous, leaned forward. "You think she's experimenting?" Roper's eyes flicked toward the flickering candle. "I think she's touched something she doesn't understand." The men agreed to act. They would accuse her formally, malpractice, blasphemy, perhaps even murder if evidence allowed. But evidence was thin, and Charleston was still a city of whispers, not laws. So they turned instead to something quieter, surveillance. That night, 2 men followed Mary Ellen from her cottage to the marsh road. She carried no lantern, only her satchel and a wrapped bundle that seemed to move faintly as she walked. They trailed her to the tide line, where she knelt and whispered something into the wind before placing the bundle into the water. One of the men swore it sank. The other swore it swam. When they reported what they'd seen, Dr. Roper made his decision. He would confront her himself, not as a scientist, but as a man terrified of what he could not name. He arrived at her cottage 3 nights later, storm raging outside, the windows rattling like teeth. Mary Ellen opened the door before he knocked, as though she'd been expecting him. "You want to see?" she said. He hesitated, then stepped inside. On her table lay a ledger filled with drawings, malformed fetuses, twisted spines, diagrams of plants not found in any Charleston garden. Beside it, a jar, sealed tight, held something cold and pale, floating in amber liquid. "It isn't witchcraft," she whispered. "It's what the earth is birthing now. You think you understand creation, Doctor, but something older has begun to remember itself." Dr. Roper fled into the storm, never to speak of it again. But the next morning, he called the sheriff. And the hunt for Mary Ellen Wexler officially began. The arrest came at dawn. The rain had just broken, and the cobblestones of Archdale Street shimmered like wet glass. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as 2 constables led Mary Ellen Wexler through the mist, her hands bound, her eyes lowered. She said nothing, not when they read the charges, not when they took her tools, not even when they tore the crucifix from her neck. The sheriff, a broad man named Harlan Tate, wasn't eager to prosecute. Charleston had seen witchcraft accusations before, and most had ended in shame for the accusers. But the doctors were insistent, and the church silent. Worse, the public wanted a name for their fear, and Mary Ellen's was the only one they whispered freely. At the jailhouse, she was questioned for hours. Dr. Roper was there, his face pale beneath the gaslight. "What did you bury in those marshes?" he demanded. "What are those things?" Mary Ellen's voice was calm. "You call them things because you don't see what they are." "And what are they, then?" "Children," she said softly. "Yours. Mine. The world's. The ones it tried to forget." Roper slammed his hand on the table, sending his notes scattering. "You're mad," he hissed. "Madness," she replied, "is thinking you can stop what's already begun." Word of her arrest spread through Charleston by evening. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse steps, some shouting for her release, others calling her the midwife of demons. But before she could be brought to trial, something strange happened. The sheriff's clerk misplaced the case documents. Witness statements vanished. The jar taken from her home shattered in evidence storage. And Dr. Roper himself was found in his study, wrists slit open, eyes fixed toward the river. The official record listed it as suicide. But the servants swore the doctor's body hadn't yet gone cold when they heard a knock at the back door, gentle, rhythmic, unmistakable. When they opened it, no one stood there, only a trail of wet footprints leading away into the fog. With Roper's death, the case collapsed. The town wanted quiet, not scandal. Mary Ellen was released under supervised isolation, forbidden from practicing medicine again. But the night she returned home, the candles in every window along Archdale Street flickered out at once. By morning, the fisherman found something caught in his net, a small linen bundle, bound tight, humming faintly beneath the cloth. And inside it, something was still warm. Mary Ellen did not linger in Charleston. The city had grown too loud with fear and superstition, its cobblestones too sharp with accusation. She returned to the marshlands, where reeds whispered secrets to the wind and the tide carried rumors faster than men could speak them. Here, she could walk unseen, and the world might forget her, though she knew it never truly would. Her small cottage was rebuilt on higher ground, raised on stilts to escape the rising tide. Inside, the air smelled of wet earth and dried herbs, of camphor and a faint metallic tang she could not name. She spent her days tending to the sick in secret, using remedies that science dismissed but which worked, sometimes too well. Her nights, however, belonged to the marsh. She wandered its edges with a satchel of linens and jars, whispering in a language no human ear could recognize. The infants she had buried before were not forgotten. Mary Ellen marked each grave with unassuming stones, but she returned each week. She dug quietly, under the moonlight, exhuming what had been claimed by the earth. Some were intact. Some had changed. Their forms were strange, limbs bent unnaturally, skin pale and translucent, eyes that opened and closed beneath the damp linen. She spoke to them gently, as a mother might to her children. She collected herbs from the swamp iris, marsh pennywort, and a small root known locally as a ghostweed. She crushed and boiled them into tinctures, murmuring incantations taught by no priest or doctor. She walked through the night, always listening. Sometimes the reeds bent toward her, sometimes the water seemed to move on its own, as though the tide itself were alive. A neighbor once saw her on the waterline, holding a bundle toward the sky, humming a melody that made the girls suckle and scream. "It is not mine," she said when asked, "it belongs to the marsh. It awakens, and I simply tend." The townspeople, ignorant of her night work, began speaking of her less as a midwife and more as a legend. Children dared each other to peek at the edge of the marsh at night, claiming to see lanterns bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps. Sailors swore the water glimmered with something that resembled ice. Mary Ellen herself noticed a change in the infants. Some began to move when no one watched. Some whispered sounds beneath the linen that she could just almost, understand. And in the heart of the marsh, under the silver sweep of moonlight, Mary Ellen realized the truth she had feared. She had delivered not only children, but something else entirely. And whatever it was waking. By midsummer, the town of Charleston had grown uneasy once more. Mothers whispered in hushed tones about children born with strange features, eyes unnaturally wide, hands gnarled, and skin that gleamed almost translucent under lamplight. Some families fled the city quietly, unwilling to confront what they feared Mary Ellen had birthed. Others watched from their windows, hoping the rumors were only tales of superstition. One humid evening, the fisherman named Josiah Langley returned from the marsh with a strange bundle in his boat. He had been dragging his nets near the low tide when something glimmered in the water. Curious, he lifted it aboard. Beneath the muddy linen was an infant, its skin wet and pale, its eyes swollen far beyond normal proportions. It blinked slowly, deliberately, staring with a gaze that seemed to pierce into the marrow of the world. Josiah stumbled back, heart hammering, the baby's cry an otherworldly sound, somewhere between a human wail and the rasp of reeds in the wind. Word spread quickly. The city's physicians demanded an examination, but no one dared touch the child. Even the most skeptical doctor hesitated, recoiling as though the infant carried the weight of something unseen. Mary Ellen, summoned quietly, arrived with her satchel of herbs and powders. She knelt beside the baby, whispering in low tones no one could understand, and held the child as if listening to a secret only they shared. The eyes, they were the most unsettling. Inflated, glassy, and impossibly observant, they tracked every movement in the room. The room grew still. The shadows seemed to lean closer, drawn by the intensity of that gaze. Mary Ellen finally lifted the swaddling, showing the physicians what she called the truth of creation, though none of them understood what she meant. Some swore the infant muttered words in the dead language of the marsh, syllables that made their blood run cold. Others claimed that looking into its eyes caused visions, glimpses of tidal rivers filled with more pale shapes, the edges of the city swallowed by fog, and the whisper of voices calling across time. Josiah swore he had laughter, thin, hollow, echoing from the marsh, as Mary Ellen gently carried the child away into the reeds, back to where she said it belonged. The town was left with unease heavier than before, a fear unspoken but deeply felt. Mothers shut their windows. Children whispered of strange eyes in the shadows. And somewhere in the marsh, Mary Ellen tended to the things the city could neither name nor accept. And the eyes, if swollen and unblinking, were only the beginning. The night Mary Ellen disappeared, the city of Charleston slept uneasily. A heavy fog rolled off the harbor, curling around lamp posts and clinging to cobblestones like fingers. Even the tide seemed hesitant, lapping quietly at the docks as if afraid to disturb what was about to unfold. Her cottage on the marsh had grown quiet for days before anyone noticed. The fire no longer burned. The lanterns were cold. Jars of herbs sat untouched, their powders dulled by dust. Locals whispered of her walks into the reeds, but no one knew for certain where she went, or if she ever intended to return. The first discovery was made by Josiah Langley, the fisherman who had seen the swollen-eyed infant weeks earlier. He arrived at the marsh road at dawn, expecting the familiar sound of Mary Ellen grinding her herbs and humming low melodies. Instead, he found the cottage empty, the door swinging on its hinges. Inside, nothing remained of her presence except for a single linen bundle placed carefully on the table. It contained nothing alive, only damp cloth, yet it pulsed faintly in his hands, as if imbued with the memory of something that had been. Neighbors scoured the surrounding marshes for days. They called out her name, but the only response was the croak of frogs and the hiss of the tide. The reeds seemed thicker, the mist heavier, almost sentient. Children swore they saw a figure moving just beyond sight, watching from the edges of the fog, then vanishing when approached. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said Mary Ellen had been claimed by the marsh, taken by spirits of the tide as punishment for meddling with life itself. Others whispered that she had left, carrying the creatures she had birthed to some faraway place where they could live without fear of men. Some even claimed she had merged with her creations, becoming neither fully human nor entirely of this world. The city officials, doctors, and clergy were at a loss. No trial, no evidence, no bodies, only the lingering dread of what had been seen. The fear of Charleston shifted quietly, turning inward. Mothers tucked their children deeper into beds. Men avoided the water at night. And always, at the edge of town, the fog seemed thicker, heavier, as if guarding a secret it would never reveal. By the end of the week, the marsh seemed empty, yet the stories persisted. Lanterns bobbed in the mist. Strange sounds drifted from the tidal channels. And for those who dared venture close, a pair of eyes sometimes glimmered faintly in the reeds, watching, waiting, remembering. Mary Ellen Wexler had vanished. But her legacy, and the monsters she delivered, remained. Years passed, but Charleston never forgot. The fog-wrapped streets carried whispers of children born in the dead of night, children who should not exist. Some families claimed that the midwife's influence lingered, that Mary Ellen Wexler had delivered not just infants but fragments of something older, something that defied the laws of flesh and blood. Occasionally, children would appear at the edges of town. They were pale, almost translucent, with eyes too large for their small faces, hands that moved with an eerie grace. They did not cry like other children. Their voices were soft, melodic, yet carried a resonance that seemed to echo from the marsh itself. Mothers recoiled, priests shook their heads, and doctors struggled for words. Even the boldest refused to touch them. Some families reported that the children vanished for days at a time, wandering along the salt flats and tidal channels. When they returned, they carried small bundles of reeds or seashells, arranging them in strange patterns. They spoke of things that lived under the mud and watched from the water, words no one could understand. Others whispered that the children would stare at the horizon, muttering numbers or names that belonged to no one alive. The city attempted to explain the phenomenon with disease, fever, and poor hygiene, but none of the theories fit. The pattern of these births, precise, deliberate, and impossible, was undeniable. And always, in the background of every story, Mary Ellen's name persisted, whispered reverently or fearfully, as if she were both protector and harbinger. By 1855, the phenomenon had attracted the attention of doctors beyond Charleston. Medical journals mentioned cases of infants exhibiting anomalous growths and ocular irregularities, but the reports were sparse, dismissed as anomalies or exaggerations. Yet those who had seen the children firsthand never doubted what they had witnessed. And the children grew, slowly, unnaturally. They retained strange behaviors, the avoidance of sunlight, attraction to water and marshland, and the unsettling way their eyes seemed to record everything. No parent could deny that these were not ordinary children. Mary Ellen Wexler had vanished decades earlier, yet in these children, she lived on. Some said they carried her knowledge, her secrets, and her burden of life that no one could explain. Others claimed the children were signs, warnings of what happens when the natural order is disturbed. Charleston had not birthed these children, Mary Ellen had. And somewhere, deep in the fog and marsh, the midwife watched, waiting for the world to catch up. The marsh has always been patient, silent, and indifferent, but it remembers. Charleston's tides, carrying salt and decay, whispered of Mary Ellen Wexler long after she vanished. Locals learned that proximity to the marsh after dark was dangerous. Strange shapes were glimpsed in fog, and a chill lingered where her lantern had once swung. Fishermen told stories of nets snagging on unseen weights, bundles that seemed too heavy to float yet refused to sink. Children dared not approach the tidal flats alone. Travelers spoke of voices, faint, pleading, and sometimes angry, echoing across the reeds. Those who ignored the warnings returned with strange marks on their skin, bruises like the imprint of tiny hands, their eyes haunted. Even in daylight, the marsh seemed aware. The air was heavy with decay, yet pregnant with life. Flowers bloomed in unnatural patterns, insects swarmed in formations that suggested intent. Mary Ellen had taught herself the secrets of the earth here, using herbs and water, tide and soil, and the marsh itself had absorbed her knowledge. Those who ventured too far at night sometimes returned speaking words no one understood, trembling as if memories not their own had taken hold. The city council tried to reclaim parts of the marsh for development. Dredging and clearing were attempted, but tools broke. Horses refused to enter the wetlands. Even the bravest men reported hearing cries that weren't human. Charleston slowly learned to respect the boundary. And yet, the children persisted. Every so often, one would be seen wandering the marsh's edge, staring into the water as if listening to a secret tide. Old women swore the infants carried whispers of Mary Ellen's lessons, fragments of her dark craft, encoded into their tiny forms. She had vanished, yes, but the marsh remembered her. It amplified her presence, protected her legacy, then punished those who trespassed unprepared. Some believed she had become one with it, no longer bound by flesh, but by the pulse of the earth and the rhythm of the tide. Her footsteps, lantern in hand, were said to glide across the reeds, leaving no mark, yet always watching. And Charleston, ever curious, ever skeptical, never ceased to feel her presence. Even centuries later, visitors walking the faggy edges of the tidal flats report glimpses of a small figure, pale and silent, tending to what the city cannot name. The marsh never forgives. It never forgets. And those who enter uninvited may find that Mary Ellen's monsters, once swaddled and secret, are still waiting. Decades after Mary Ellen Wexler disappeared, Charleston remained haunted not by ghosts alone, but by the consequences of her work. Families who had once feared her whispered of children who grew strange, whose presence could not be explained. Some left the city quietly, taking their swollen-eyed offspring into the unknown. Others stayed, hiding what could not be hidden, whispering prayers to keep the restless tide at bay. Mary Ellen's legacy refused to die. The infants she had delivered, now grown, but still different, wandered the edges of the marsh and alleys, appearing at odd hours with pale skin and eyes too wide, as if seeing things beyond mortal understanding. Scholars who visited the city wrote of abnormal births in hushed footnotes, dismissing them as anomalies. Yet eyewitnesses described behaviors that were deliberate, purposeful, and unsettling. The children moved with a knowing, almost human awareness, yet something beyond humanity lingered in their gestures, in the silent measurements of their gaze. The marsh itself became an extension of her will. Fishermen swore that nets would snag at the waterline, not on driftwood, but on bundles that seemed alive. Travelers reported whispers carried across the tide, faint at first, then unmistakable, as though the marsh spoke to those who dared trespass. Those who attempted to dig in places she once tended found nothing but mud and water, yet occasionally, in the shape of the soil, they could swear they saw the outlines of tiny bodies, curled and waiting. Local legend grew. Parents warned children to stay from the water, not just for fear of drowning, but for fear of what lingered beneath. Tales of pale infants, bundles moving in fog, and lanterns swinging in unseen hands spread like wildfire. Mary Ellen's name became a cipher, a shorthand for unnatural births, marsh-bound secrets, and the quiet persistence of a woman who had, in life and absence, defied natural law. And still, the marsh waits. Rain, tide, and fog preserve her memory. Her midwifery, her unnatural gift, whispers through the city like a tidal rhythm. Those who venture too far may glimpse lantern light bobbing through reeds, may hear murmurs in a language not taught in any school, may feel the gaze of eyes that have endured decades, watching, remembering, judging. Mary Ellen Wexler delivered more than children, she delivered a legacy. A legacy that refused burial. A legacy that remains, whispered through the salt and mud, etched in the fog, carried forever by the marsh, waiting for the curious, the daring, or the unwary. Tell me in the comments, do you believe Mary Ellen was a savior, a scientist ahead of her time, or something darker entirely?